I will invite Dr. Alan Gamlen from Monash University. He's an associate professor of geography and at Monash University, Melbourne, and a long-standing research associate at Oxford University, Center on Migration Policy and Society. He holds a doctorate from the same university, that's Oxford, and in New Zealand, as a New Zealand Bright Future Scholar. Alan's research focuses on the geography and governance of international migration. I think, and you are also associated with Migration Studies, the well-known journal, isn't it, Alan? Alan,
that's
you
right,
have 7 minutes. 7 minutes, Alan. We will listen to you 7 minutes, and then we'll come back again. So please address the issue of whether there is going to be brain drain post-COVID-19.
Thanks very much, Binod. And it's really lovely to see you again. Thank you very much to the hosts for the invitation. Congratulations on a really timely initiative. I'm going to just offer a few very basic thoughts based on a paper that I recently wrote for Compass on migration and mobility after the 2020 pandemic. So the question we're discussing is, will there be a brain drain after COVID-19? Obviously, the first thing to point out is we can only give tentative answers, yes, because the outcome depends on a lot of decisions that haven't been made yet, and people can change their minds. But I think we can identify the known unknowns in this situation. That is, we can highlight what the outcome depends on, the key variables. And I think, put very simply, it's a question of how much migration will flow from where to where after the pandemic. And to predict that, we need to predict what will happen to three things: demand for immigration, supply of would-be immigrants, and the openness or restrictiveness of migration policies. So I think whether or not there's going to be a brain drain from any particular place after the pandemic will depend on these key factors. So I'll spend the next few minutes just briefly addressing those three questions. How will demand for labour migration change? How will supply of immigration, or put differently, migrant decision-making change? And how will migration controls change? So the first question is, how will demand for immigration change? And the question here really, I think, is, will destination countries need less labour immigration? And I think the answer is probably yes. During the pandemic, unemployment rates have risen rapidly to an extent that will almost certainly depress demand for immigrant labour in the medium term, at least. The International Monetary Fund's predicting the worst downturn since the Great Depression, starting with a contraction of 3% globally this year. The European Union is predicting its worst depression ever, which is quite something considering how bad it got in the 1930s. So firms, companies that survive this cull are going to have access to a large recruitment pool of unemployed native workers, and they'll face political pressure to employ native workers over migrant workers. And even though not all of those unemployed workers will be able to retrain or will move into jobs that are perceived to be below their station, the net result is probably going to be, almost certainly, I think, going to be a series of major destination economies that, because of the global recession, will be less dependent on immigrant labour. And I think it's also important to highlight that the labour market impacts of the pandemic are going to differ by skill level. In some countries, immigrant workers are predominantly concentrated in high and low skilled jobs that are classified as essential, including healthcare, infrastructure, maintenance, food production and delivery, and so forth. Fewer jobs are going to be lost in those industries. And instead, the losses might be concentrated in the medium skilled jobs in sectors like manufacturing, retail, tourism, which are often classified as non-essential and are already experiencing, disruptive transformation as a result of technology. That matters because if immigrants appear to retain jobs during a period when native workers appear to be losing jobs, there's a danger of perceived competition for jobs between native and migrant workers, and that's a potential source of really toxic anti-immigrant attitudes. So second question is, I think, how will migrant decision-making change? And this speaks to the question of, will supply of migrants change as a result of the pandemic? And I think that the answer is the pandemic might be reshaping individual and household level decisions about migration in two specific ways. On one hand, some types of people will probably be less likely to migrate. Migration's a risky decision. It's one that might pay off only in the long term. And recent research by the economists Anand Dupuy and Michelle Ben really interestingly show how other major crises have made, like earthquakes, have made people more risk-averse and more impatient. So if that's the case, some of those people will be less likely to move if the pandemic has a similar effect. On the other hand, there's going to be some people who are more likely to move, particularly those who desperately need to flee livelihood collapse that's resulted from the economic crisis, which has resulted from the pandemic, or people who are fleeing more politically unstable situations that are perhaps a stage along from that kind of recession. So that type of movement, there may be a bit more pressure to move there. And then also people who have been unable to send remittances home or to receive remittances during the lockdowns and who will be desperate to get those remittances flowing again. It's going to make those people more likely to move. So I think that the net result is going to be potentially a period of unpredictable migration flows, where some places are sending less migrants than normal, and some places are sending more migrants than normal. And so in order to make some specific predictions in that environment, I think it's a matter of focusing on specific corridors. And I think if the corridor is largely characterized by voluntaristic, opportunistic migration, it's probably likely that people will wait until there's less risk in the world and migrate later. Whereas if the corridor is primarily dominated by involuntary survival-oriented migration, the pandemic may increase the pressure to move.
Okay, we'll come back to you, Alan. We'll come back to you as a policy advisor to the Australian government, in the sense that taking into account all these incentives or decision-making procedures on both the demand and supply side, when the countries need some particular kind of people, particular professionals, say STEM professionals, then what the countries are going to be or should be doing to be, they are going to depend on policy advisors like yourself. And so while you keep thinking, we'll come back to you and seek more of your intervention. In the